Now, you're all going to have some homework when this is over, because it's not like this stuff is going to magically happen. But even if you decide you want to go the light route, you're actually going to be in pretty good shape compared to most of the world. But let me go ahead and establish the high bar here. Let me give you guys a little bit of tough love. Here, of course, we have the muskeg, which is the majority of the territory in the northeastern part of the province. It's a permafrost bog. Infrastructure in this area is extraordinarily difficult to build, and you're going to need massive infrastructure expansions if you want to take advantage of this moment in time. The world is going to be losing access to a huge proportion of the mineral resources that we use to make modern life function. And if we really are serious about the green transition, then the task ahead of us in terms of things like copper and zinc and nickel and the rest are almost an order of magnitude bigger than they are already, and we're still going to lose access to the material. Manitoba is one of the very few places in the world that is a first world country that actually has access to these things. Unfortunately, for the most part, it's probably in the wrong part of the province, which means you have to deal with this. The territory in the north, the territory on the shield. There's another problem. For anyone to carry out operations in the muskeg or on the shield, you have to have fantastic investment clarity. No one is going to commit $1 billion when they can't get a clear answer out of the provincial government. And Manitoba is unfortunately known not so much for slow walking permitting, but just not responding in some cases for years. You have to make them want to come to you. You have to make it easy. Now, with that said, the potential here is actually pretty good. Now, what we've got on the left are the known deposits for various materials that are going to be in shortage in the world. Working from left to right, we've got copper, then we've got nickel, uranium, gold, and lithium. You guys have them all. You know where these are. So even in the worst case scenario where nothing significant changes in Manitoba, you're going to be seeing some new interest. But check out the map on the right. That whole orange section is the Canadian shield. And geologically speaking, a shield is a section of the mantle, typically the lower mantle, that has been lifted up over the eons and is now on the Earth's surface. And the lower mantle is where most of the interesting materials that we mine come from. And Canada has been blessed with one of the largest concentrations and one of the largest shields in the world. The problem for Manitoba is your portion of the shield is under the muskeg. So all that northeastern kind of quadrant of Manitoba on the left map where you don't see very many mineral dots, that doesn't mean that there's nothing there. It's actually your best geology by far. It's just that it's under the permafrost and the bog and you haven't done much exploration there at all. I have no doubt that if you went out there and did the exploration, that you would find at least as much per square kilometer as the Quebecois and the Ontarians have found. But you have to create an investment in climate that encourages people to actually go look. The biggest problem that Manitoba has is its best geology is under its worst geography, and its best geography in the south and the southwest has its worst geology. So there is an outsized opportunity here, but you've got to encourage that prospecting before this kind of system can get off the ground. Okay, now, like I said, if you just work with what you know, there's still a lot. But if you want like an explosive outsized opportunity, you will need to change a few things. Now, put that in the back of your mind for now. We're going to come back to that. Let's talk about how the rest of the world is doing, because it's not a very pretty picture. And of course, we have to start with the war. These are two maps of the Russian space. They're turned on their side a little bit, so if you have to do that, that's okay. I'm not going to judge. On the right, you've got a population density map. And the orange there is roughly the population, the lighter orange that goes from Central Europe down in a V to Central Siberia. That is roughly the population density of Manitoba, southern Manitoba, if you exclude Winnipeg. So yes, there are people there. Yes, you know the names of your neighbors, but you probably don't see them all that often. But on the left, you've got the same geographic hit, but with a different data set. Now, the green is the Russian wheat belt. This is where most the population lives. But the Russian wheat belt is not like most agricultural zones elsewhere. In the summer, the weather is roughly similar to western Kansas, so hot and dry. And in the winter, it is roughly similar to northeastern Alberta, so cold and dry and windy. Per square kilometer, the Russian wheat belt generates the least amount of income of any agricultural zone in the world. It's just that they're a major power in grain markets because they have so much land to work with. But because the net income per chunk of land is so low, Russia has never been able to generate the economic activity necessary to afford a road network. So if you want to move things at scale within the Russian system, it has to go by rail. Now, if you go to the right of that green zone, of the wheat belt, to the blue in the north, that's tundra and taigai. No one lives there. If you go to the left, to the yellow in the south, that's desert. No one lives there. And as bad as that is, what really gets the Russians depressed is when they see the beige. Territories that are not economically viable, but you can't do anything with, and they're flat. And so if you have a Mongol horde that happens to wander through, they can just roar right through it and get into the green and get fast and loose. And the Russians have really never defeated a foe that has managed to reach the green. They have to wait for the weather to do it for them. So the Russian strategy for the last 350 years has always been the same. Advance out of the green through the beige until they reach these geographic blocking points, places where you can't run a panzer division through. And then forward position those very slow-moving, rail-supplied troops in the access points between the barriers. When the Soviet system existed, the Russians controlled all of them. When the Soviet system collapsed, post-Soviet Russia only controlled one. Everything that Vladimir Putin has done in the last 23 years, in terms of foreign affairs, has been about rebuilding those blocking positions. This was the Crimea War, the Donbass War, the Karabakh intervention. This is the Georgian War. This is the Kazakh intervention. It's all about rebuilding that forward position block. The scale of what the Russians are attempting here is immense. Their borders are 3 times the length of the US borders, and they're trying to plug them with a population that is dying and is half the size. This war was always going to happen. And for the Ukrainians, it's not so much that their territory that the Russians want, although they are. It's that 2 of those blocking points are on the opposite side of Ukrainian territory. So it's not that the Russians aren't going to stop until they have all of Ukraine. It's that the Russians aren't going to stop when they have all of Ukraine. This is roughly step 4 of 7 from the Russian point of view. And once they're done with Ukraine, if they can pull that off, the next set of countries up are Romania, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, NATO allies all. So that's the big picture. Let's look about what's going on right now. The dotted lines on this map are the rail lines. That's how the Russians move around. The deep red are the territories that they controlled on the first day of this war. They actually captured those territories in the Donbass and Crimean conflicts from 2014. And then the pink are the zones that they held on the 1st of September. Now, about 3.5, almost 4 months ago, these 2 green arrows, they're pointing towards something called the Kherson Pocket. It is the only territory that is west of the river Dnieper that the Ukrainians have, that the Russians were able to capture earlier in the war. 3.5, 4 months ago, the Ukrainians started advertising that their first major counteroffensive was going to target Kherson. So the Russians relocated tens of thousands of troops, they probably have 30,000 troops there now total. Their best troops, their best equipment there in order to absorb that advance. And on September 1, the assault began. Also on September 1, the Ukrainians looked around to see where the Russians pulled those troops from and launched a second offensive there in Kharkiv province. And as we know, the Russian position completely collapsed. In a matter of 5 days, the Ukrainians captured more equipment from the Russians than Ukraine had on the first day of the war. So they doubled the size of their artillery and their tank brigades. They captured more equipment in those 5 days than NATO has transferred this entire time. Which means we need to talk about NATO a little bit here. You guys remember in the first week of the war when the Russians had that 40-mile long convoy that was going south from Belarus to Kiev, and we're like, oh crap, this is it, it's over.